All right, Mike, we are here live from Chatsworth, New Jersey at our Gator studio. And today we wanted to do a turf Q&A. And this, Mike, is based on all the questions that we get from our turf presentations that we've done this year.
Yeah, this is actually the most interesting show to me out of everything we've done all year, George. All new, interesting concepts with turf, some tips and tricks for installing putting greens, doing that popular checkerboard pattern. I think we're going to teach these guys a lot today.
Yeah, this is going to be a really cool program today. Before we get into the program, just some brief introductions here. My name's George Biter. I'm the Vice President of Sales at Alliance, and with me here is Mike Huber. He is our Director of Technical Support and Services, but Mike, you do a whole lot more than that at Alliance.
Yeah, I kind of do all the jobs that don't fit in anybody else's job description. So work a little bit on product development, training for our reps, for our customers, and troubleshooting things that go wrong in the field.
Yeah, and truly, Mike's being humble there. He's instrumental to Alliance. He's really instrumental to the industry. Everywhere I go around, North America and even the world, people are talking about the training that you do. Mike brings a ton of knowledge to this industry, from the polymeric sand that we've done for 20 plus years to now artificial turf. Also behind the scenes is our man Tim. Tim runs all the video production that you see here, and we really invested a lot in learning this to bring you the best possible content, the best experience with the multi-camera experience. So thank you, Tim, and please, in the chat room, pump out some questions. We've got our man Rick here. He's our sales analyst with Alliance, and he's been a rep in Ohio for a number of years. So he's going to be moderating the chat room, and he's going to be talking to us a little bit about it as we dive in. So, Mike, like we said, we want to talk about some edge restraint options. That's a popular question that we're getting. We got to talk about putting greens. We're going to talk about that checkerboard applications, and then talk some quote considerations here in our program today. So an action-packed program.
Yeah, and then whatever other questions trickle in as we go, right?
Yeah, please. Those could be at the end, and certainly keep them coming throughout the entire program. That's what makes it fun. That's what makes it interesting. And with that, let's talk about things here. We want to talk about edge restraint first for turf options. A lot of times you don't need it, right?
Right, you may be going up against existing pavers or concrete, the foundation of a house. You could be going up against some kind of Belgian block or split curbstone wall.
Right.
So there may be many areas where your turf is simply butting up against a hard surface. It's recessed slightly.
Yep.
We don't need any kind of edge restraint.
And then there are those applications where you don't want turf just ending and into nothing. So you're going to need something to secure the turf down, and something might to actually look visually attractive too.
Right, so we want to make sure that turf isn't getting kicked or pulled up as people walk across it on an exposed edge.
Right.
We kind of want to keep it tucked down so it's not getting frayed or damaged. So there's a couple different ways to do that. Some may be better than others.
Yep.
In fact, a lot of the more expensive options out there might not even be the best.
Yeah, for sure. We'll show you here a few options here that we've looked into. And again, we've been researching this. We've had turf now into the market, Mike, for about 3 months, but really probably for 18 months now. We've been doing research and sourcing the materials and looking into this stuff. So tell us what you found on the edge restraint. The first one that you have here, it's a product called Vert Edge. Tell me more about this.
Right, so Vert Edge is a plastic piece of, almost looks like edge restraint for pavers.
Yes, it does.
So what we're going to do with this piece here, I'll show you the back profile of it. So this piece of plastic is essentially going to be installed directly on top of our crushed stone base.
Okay.
Right, so we put our 3/4 minus in, and then we would spike this Vert Edge down.
Right.
And then install our stone dust setting bed layer, right? So our stone dust setting bed layer would come right up to the top lip here.
Yeah. Mike, humor me for a minute, and if Tim could help us out and pull up a cross-section of what a typical artificial turf installation looks like, it might help our audience kind of understand what you're talking about and where this piece goes with the crushed stone base.
So similar to pavers, we're going to do 4 to 6 inches of crushed compacted stone as our foundation.
Yep.
And then we're going to do a 3/4 inch layer of compacted stone dust or screenings. That gives us a great, high capacity bearing surface to put our turf down. It's not going to be kind of mushy underfoot like sand would be. Obviously, you put your turf on top of that and your infill in the turf. But what we're showing you now is that this Vert Edge would go directly on top of that compacted crushed stone.
So in between the crushed stone and below the stone dust is where the vert edge would go.
Right, so then we fill this in with our stone dust, right, bringing it up flush. So essentially you're going to have this plastic edge here exposed on the edge of your setting bed.
Okay, so this you would see at the finished product or no?
Well, you're going to see it before you put the turf down.
Okay, but the finished end, after you put the turf, you're going to hang over this, right?
Right, that's the idea. So we actually have a piece here that we've completed. So you can see here, essentially what we're doing is letting that turf hang over the edge, right? Not too far, right to the edge there.
Okay.
And we're gluing the turf itself to the vert edge.
Okay.
So now we've got our turf. That end kind of curves downward, which is going to kind of help keep it tucked in.
Okay, makes sense there.
And prevent it from getting kicked up or pulled up.
Okay, fantastic. Now, on this table, I see a little bit of a hump. You know, help us understand, and more to the viewer, how this isn't going to go there because you're filling this in with the stone dust, correct?
Well, you're going to have a slight taper at the edge, right?
Taper down.
I think that's kind of natural. We kind of want that to transition. But once you fluff up this turf with your power broom and your infill, it's not going to look quite as much like it's curving downward.
Okay. So, and then again, this would be held up by the stone dust. So you're flat here and the taper goes down, which I agree with you. It looks nice and clean there on the edge. It looks kind of like a natural turf would end, and you could end that into basically anything, a mulch bed, a sidewalk if you want, pathway, whatever.
Right, even just the area where you're walking from artificial turf onto regular grass.
Sure. Okay, that's a good point too.
So that is one option out there, right? You got to kind of pre-plan this. You've got to pre-plan your area for your turf by putting this on your actual base before you put your stone dust layer in, and then you would have to cut your turf off to fit.
Perfect. So, Mike, I notice obviously these pieces are straight, 2.5 feet, give or take. Any option for radius?
Certainly. We're not always going to install square pieces of turf, right?
Likely
not. It would
not.
make life easy if we did, but we're not going to. So you can simply snip the back of the vert edge, similar to cutting our Gator X4 or rigid edge, and then it'll bend and be flexible. Okay,
and you can get a certain radius out of this. It does have some limitations because it's a rigid piece of plastic. You know, at some point it does snap. You can't do a right angle on this, I suspect.
No, well, you could put two pieces together and do a right angle.
Sure. All right. So that's the vert edge. That's one option, Mike. And then there's a couple other options that we wanted to come through and talk about today. The next option is a product called Wonder Edge. Mike, what are we talking about with Wonder Edge?
Well, Wonder Edge is a similar plastic edge restraint, right? Almost looks like a paver edge as well. And this is designed to be exposed in the end, right? So that vert edge was kind of hidden. The actual Wonder Edge is designed to physically be the edge restraint, the actual edge of your turf product. So they have two different versions. They've got the regular and then the low profile here.
Okay, that makes sense here. And you're right, it does look a lot like a traditional paver edge, and I can see you are going to get a nice clean finish if this is what you're looking for, versus that vert edge has a more of a natural look to it.
Right. So with this product, you're going to install this on top of your compacted stone duster screenings, right?
Okay.
So we'll do our crushed stone base, we'll do our screenings, and then we will put this down directly on top of those compacted screenings on the same plane as our turf.
Makes sense. I get it. So you've got you said there's two different styles on it, and you've got different colors there as well.
Right. So essentially what we're going to do, let me get this in frame for you here. We're going to tuck our turf into the gap there, right?
Okay.
So we end up with what's a pretty nice looking edge.
Yeah, very clean edge here. You're tucking it in. Obviously, you're going to spike it down, like Mike said, directly on top of the stone dust. You're going to put in your spikes naturally before you tuck the turf in. And then that gives you a very nice clean look here. And if Tim's coming on the overhead there, you could see if this was a pathway, it would be lined pretty cleanly, or you have a transition to the other area. There's two different styles I see, Mike. The heights are very different. What's
so you've
what's
got
the substance there?
A larger profile, and then you got this very low profile, which you could tuck that turf into. The low profile is a little bit tougher to tuck the turf into, we've found.
Yep.
But you can get it in there, and you got a lower threshold as far as your transition to the turf.
Yep. And the one benefit of that, you know, for ADA compliance, this product is advertised as ADA compliance because with that low profile, you can transition things over, obviously, you know, wheelchair access and things like that. So that's the benefit of the low profile. It is a little more challenging to tuck it in, like Mike just showed you, but it does have some advantages.
You also get some connectors, with that Wonder Edge, so you can physically connect two pieces together. So you simply slide your connector in to the plastic, and then you would connect your next piece here inside. So we can join two pieces, gives us a nice, clean, uniform look with the same height.
Yeah. And this has some flexibility to it, Mike, so you can make radiuses out of this naturally?
It's a little bit tougher to make a good radius with the Wonder Edge here. It's a stiffer material, doesn't bend quite as nicely.
Okay, and even the lower profile piece, I suspect, has a little more give to it. But these pieces, again, we're showing you some options here, pros and cons to each, from flexibility to ADA compliance. Those are some things to consider when choosing your edge restraint.
One of the other cons with that Wonder Edge is that it's always exposed, right? So it's more prone to becoming brittle over time from UV light exposure,
Sure enough.
being damaged by, weed whacker, lawnmower, things like that. So perhaps having that hidden edge is a little bit better.
Mike, I don't know about you, but I don't cut my artificial turf. That's the one advantage. It's somewhat maintenance-free, so I don't have to cut it. But I hear what you're saying if you're transitioning into a natural turf element.
All right. So that's one of the plastic edge options out there.
Okay.
The other way that people commonly install and secure their artificial turf is actually by burying a ledger strip into their base.
Yeah, so these ledger strips are popular. There's a lot of different types of them, ranging from pressure-treated lumber and going into composite materials like an AZEK board and things like that. And obviously, there's various sizes to that. You've got anything from a 1x4 to a 2x4, even up to a 4x4. But Mike, I don't understand how you use that. You got a 4x4. I don't know if I want to see that, and it's certainly going to be a trip hazard unless I'm making a bocce ball court.
Well, the 4x4 frame was really popular, 20 years ago?
Right.
They would edge pavers in 4x4s. But what we're talking about is recessing this, right? This is going to be invisible. It'll be underneath your turf.
Okay.
So right along the edge of our turf, what we're going to do is actually incorporate that 2x4 or 4x4 or bender board into the base itself, right? So we're going to basically set it at the same height as our stone dust layer.
Okay.
You could even use it to help screed off your base and setting bed, right?
True. So you're in the application here, Mike, you're talking about installing your base, and then you're going to have to, at the edges where you want this
turf
2x4, you're going to have to basically submerge that so it's flush with the surface of the stone dust, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So a little more involved installation because you're trenching stuff out versus the others. Maybe you're pulling back a layer of stone dust and spiking, or just spiking directly.
You got to plan it, but if you plan ahead of time, like I said, you could potentially use that to help screed and set your heights, so it might make life easier in some ways.
Yeah, makes sense.
All right, so obviously you do a 2x4 or 4x4, we're not bending that, right?
Right, yeah. So that's one of the disadvantages of using pressure-treated lumber is there's really no give to it. You've got a piece of AZEK board in your hand there. What's the advantage of that?
Well, it's a composite lumber, so it's not going to rot, right?
Yep.
Treated lumber will last a long time. That composite wood will last even longer, and it's a little bit more flexible, right? So we can get a bend or curve to it.
Right.
If we wanted to curve that along the outer edge, that composite wood's going to work a lot better. On the West Coast, that bender board's pretty popular.
Yeah, very popular. Bender board, it works, and pretty common out West Coast and in some of the Southeast United States. So those composites, they have a nice advantage. There's no breakdown, even though you're pressure treated. You still have some, potential rotting and things like that. But the composite boards have that value add. They're flexible, and they're certainly not going to rot, decompose on you.
All right. So how are we actually attaching this to the wood? You going to screw it down, or?
I'm probably not going to screw it down because we want this to be as natural looking as possible. I don't want a screw head visible, nor do I want to crush some of the grass blades. So I see you've got your handy dandy Milwaukee stapler there. Let's take a look at how that performs.
Right, so basically what you want to do is probably use a 1/4 inch narrow crown stapler and galvanized staples, right?
Yeah.
That's going to allow you to get in between those rows of grass blades without crushing any. You're going to last a long time because it's galvanized. That's really the best way to secure your turf to that ledger strip, whatever it happens to be, pressure treated, composite wood. Works for all of them.
Now, Mike, you mentioned galvanized. Now we're taking a right-hand turn from what we talk about with spikes. Let's just remind our audience here our position on galvanized versus non-galvanized with respect to the spikes.
Right. If you're using spikes for hardscape edging or spikes for your turf install, we want them to be non-galvanized. So they rust into the ground, more resistance to being pulled out. But these staples are going to be really hard to pull out. So galvanized means they're not going to rust over time and degrade. The staples are small, right? Yeah. they could rust through if they aren't galvanized, whereas a spike is going to actually grow larger with that rust and last a long time.
Right, and we're talking about going into wood or composite, so you're not talking about, you know, generally a lot of water like you would in the base material itself. So
go ahead, line that up on there.
All right, so we're going to come over the top, and remember that's going to be flush with the layer of stone dust.
So I'm going to kind of wiggle my way in between the blades of grass.
Yep. And when you say wiggle your way into the blades of grass, you're trying to find that space in between the stitch gauge, aren't you?
Exactly. I don't want to staple over blades of grass and kind of lock them down or hold them down or bend them unnaturally. So I'm basically trying to find that space in between the rows of stitching and get my staple in there.
Yeah, and you could feel your way around. It looked like when you were going in there with that staple gun to kind of feel the little peaks of the stitch gauge and drop in between.
Work your way in between, wiggle that in there, and that's pretty solidly attached.
Yeah, we're not pulling that apart. You got a nice deep you know, a penetration in there with that staple. That's a solid form. So in the end, Mike, we presented 3 options. You got a couple of plastic options that have, you know, a clean edge, a more natural looking edge, and then you have this, which would be more natural looking because the wood's buried. In your position, what's going to be the strongest? Which would you recommend?
I really think that you have the most flexibility, the lowest cost, and the best performance out of the wood or composite wood. You know, using that recessed ledger board to actually staple your turf down is going to give you the most flexibility on your job site and the longest lasting performance there.
Yeah.
You know, this is solid. It's not going to go anywhere. You can do different shapes, different areas. Really the ideal solution.
Sure. Good. Let's take a look and see, do we have any questions here coming in from the chat room, Rick? How are we looking on the question portion?
We don't have any questions on edging yet, but we do have some when we get to infill.
All right. So do you want to take the infill now, Mike? Or
yeah, we're not really going to get to infill on this presentation, so we might as well take them now.
All right, Rick, fire off. Let's talk infill here.
A couple questions about infill. The first one is, do we need it? I've heard from other manufacturers that we don't need infill. Is it necessary?
I love that question, Mike, because there is a little movement here that is discussing that infill and not needed. Our position is you absolutely need infill, and we have 2 really primary reasons for that. Mike, walk us through that.
All right, so the infill is going to help to weight down the turf, you know, actually physically ballast it and make it heavier, more resistance to movement.
Yep.
That turf is going to also benefit from that infill holding the blades of grass upright. We use an engineered blade shape. There is no one that has some special magic turf that doesn't need infill to help hold those blades upright. Infill is going to make any turf better, whether it's ours or someone else's. You know, you can draw real life comparisons, right? You don't need to wear deodorant, but I'm glad that George is. So there are definite benefits to that infill. It's going to make Gator turf and anyone else's turf perform better. Those blades will stand upright more. It won't move as much. Get better shock absorption.
Right, right. A lot of advantages to it. So our position is, yes, you need it, and Mike just walked you through that. And then we had a couple programs to watch that go deeper into that infill. Rick, anything else we want to cover here before we move on?
I do have one more question here. This is from Jim. He would like to know if Xturf can be installed on a concrete base.
That's a great question. Can Xturf be installed on a concrete base, Mike? I'm going to say you could certainly do it, but there's some challenges too.
Right, so we put Xturf down on concrete. That's a nice solid foundation, right?
Absolutely would be.
Where's the water going to go?
That's the big question I would have, because this turf has drainage holes. It is going to move the water through the turf, but then, Mike, you have a problem.
Right, so let's make sure we have proper pitch on our concrete slab.
Right.
Let's make sure we maybe have drainage holes poured in that concrete slab to allow water to drain through. And then we can't use spikes when we attach the turf to the concrete. We're going to have to glue it.
Yeah.
So we have to make sure that our glue isn't going to block off the flow of water and dam it up.
Right, and that's a big point here. You know, obviously in certain areas too, like the Northeast, the Midwest, and certainly the Canadian counterparts that we have, you're gonna, have a lot of freeze-thaw conditions there. You don't want to trap moisture under your turf because now you're gonna have, unsightly movement. So you could install it over a concrete foundation. You get a nice rigid foundation, but there are some drawbacks to it, as you pointed out.
Right, we got to make sure we're going to let that water drain through, and we're going to securely attach it to that concrete somehow.
Good. All right. Please keep the questions coming. We'll stop again in a little bit and answer those on the fly here, but we'll keep moving on. I wanted to talk about seaming. If you look at what we have on the table, Mike, this is actually, if we look at the overhead, it looks pretty clean and looks like a uniform piece of turf.
That's not one piece of turf, George. That's two pieces that we put together.
Yes. So we put this together with our seam, and if we could take a look there, you can see where that seam is of the two different pieces of turf that have met together. That's where they met together with our traditional seam tape. So just a quick overview of how we seam again.
Right, so we trim off our turf. We're always removing the outer 3 rows of turf to make sure we get nice, straight, clean lines with blades that are full length, not damaged in the manufacturing or packaging process. And we make sure that we're going to maintain the same distance between the rows of turf, that same stitch gauge. So one side we trim off right against the blades, one side we trim as far away from the blades as possible. Gives us the same distance between those blades.
Yeah.
Simply use the Gator seam tape with our XP adhesive, and we can put those together and get a fairly seamless look.
That looks incredible, and it is seamless as you described it, and this works great. We've got 2 pieces of our premium turf here that we stitch together or seam together, and it looks pretty uniform and realistic looking.
But
Now,
what if you're doing different materials, right? What if you're doing a putting green and you wanted to seam some premium to the putting green itself? They're different heights, they're different material.
Yep, and that's a big challenge, Mike. I know you're not a golfer, but we still want that to look natural, and we want that ball to play naturally. And we got a couple of challenges that you pointed out with pile heights. There's also stitch gauge differences, and not all putting greens are in a straight line. Tim's going to show you here some pretty good examples of various putting greens here. So if you look at these examples here, those are going to present a lot of challenges that we typically don't see in that just straight uniform seam. You've got your fairway rough, transitioning into your putting green, and those are no longer linear seams, Mike. Those have some challenges.
Yeah, that's not an easy installation to do.
Certainly isn't.
We're going to talk about some
challenges with that. Right? Yeah, we have a miniature putting green on the table here. If you take a look overhead, you get a real nice look. And this is probably pretty traditional to what you might build in a backyard. Nice kidney shaped lima bean putting green. It does have some curves. Let's walk the audience through how you would construct this, Mike. It's not easy.
All right, so your first challenge is how you're going to get your cuts to actually match up. As you go around this putting green, how are you going to match the curvature of your putting green to the curvature of your piece of premium, right?
Right, yeah, that's going to be a huge challenge.
That's pretty difficult. And once you kind of solve that problem, how are you going to do the actual surrounding rough area itself? If you try to piece together sections of thin strips, that's going to be very challenging.
Always challenging, and we will get into checkerboard later, but those thin strips are always challenging. You've got blade orientation to consider. You've got just the challenges of working with narrow pieces.
Well, how about the fact that you have to cut from the back, right? So if you cut from the back, well, your cut's actually a mirror image of what you're trying to do.
Yes.
It's reversed. So that's a challenge too, right?
Yes. So let's look at a couple of different ways we can attack a project like this. There's really 2 options, and we've got a couple of different scenarios here. Let's look at a first one, Mike. It's a screen that looks more unnatural in terms of putting. So if that's the image that we're talking about, how would you attack that?
Well, you've got 2 different options. You could potentially go in and use one piece of larger turf and cut out that shape of the putting green, or you could use multiple pieces to work your way around it. But there's several potentially disastrous issues you'll encounter if you try to use multiple pieces. So we could probably get one piece lined up along one side like that, right?
Yep.
But then we go to the other side. All right, we get that piece in. Now we need to use a piece of turf in the middle of each one of those. We've got to change the orientation of the roll. We actually have to turn it 90 degrees to actually get the same blade direction, right? The way that those blades are laying, the way that it was made from the factory, we have to mimic that all the way around and keep those blades in the same direction.
Good. So on the diagram here that Rick's constructing us here, I can see the different pieces. How many total pieces are we talking about in this particular, what I would define as an easier putting green to construct?
Right, so on this easy square, you'd have 4 pieces, right? 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, let's think about how you're going to lay these out, right? We've got to try to cut them, match them up to the putting green, match them up to each other.
Right.
So if you had cut one of these off at a slight angle, well, all of a sudden, your ends aren't going to match up to the next piece, right? So you could have a lot of issues with trying to match up to the putting green surface itself and each adjoining piece of turf that you're using to surround it.
Right. And that yellow lines, what Mike is referencing there, is that angle piece. You know, we drew it a little more extreme, but if you're not square, you're going to end up with that kind of challenge here that's going to be unsightly in the finished product.
And that would be even harder if you were doing a round or kidney bean shaped area. You might be trying to put together more than 4 pieces.
Yeah, for sure.
The difficulty certainly increases. In fact, I don't even think that's a practical way to surround your putting green.
Yeah, no. And let's be honest. This putting green here, sure, you could do it. That's not what most homeowners are going to want. They're going to want something like what we have on the table. Let's take a look at what something like that might encounter if we were have to construct something like that.
Well, how would you actually cut these pieces? I mean, you're talking about potentially trying to seam here and draw straight across, and then you're seaming these little pieces in. But how are you going to cut to match here on this piece? Are you going to do it upside down the way we tell you to cut turf? If you hack from the top, you're going to be cutting all those grass blades off.
One thing we want to make very clear in our instructions here and our best practices is you never want to cut from the top. Even if you're posed with a putting green situation, we're going to show you what our recommendation is to always cut it from the backing side, Mike.
Right. If you start cutting from the top, it's really hard to do, right?
Yep.
You're hacking through all those grass blades. You're cutting a lot of them off unevenly, which isn't going to give you a nice appearance on the edge. Plus, you're cutting down into the stone, right? So your knife blade is going dull almost instantaneously. It's just going to be very frustrating, not going to look good in the end. So we've got to cut from the back. But when you're doing an odd shape, and it's a mirror image cutting from the back when you flip it over, it's almost impossible to keep track of.
Sure, absolutely. So let's take a look at a graphic of more involved putting green shape and look at attacking it from that same way of trying to cut up all those different pieces, Mike. So if we pull that up on the screen here, we'll show you what that would look like. This is probably more realistic to the putting green that your homeowner, your client's going to want you to build. So if we have that option there, and we went with that strip method here, what would you recommend on the cuts? The 4 that we had last time, can we do it on this project, Mike?
That's going to be really hard to do because you have to basically meet at the, I guess, innermost part of that putting green, right? So there's going to be a lot of waste, a lot of pieces. I don't know how you would really kind of figure out how to cut those off. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, it's going to be a challenge. We look at a diagram like that, and you can immediately see cutting it is going to be a challenge. There's going to be little strips, which are always difficult to deal with. You've got to match that blade orientation, so you're not always just rolling the roll out in its natural roll. You might be having to go perpendicular and cutting much smaller pieces, etc. So that's an option, but that's not the option we recommend, Mike.
Right. I think the best way to install a putting green is to simply cut your putting green shape out of a larger piece of classic or premium if you want to have that kind of fringe or rough look around it.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And we're going to take a look at that back in our graphic again, and that's roughly 15 feet wide by maybe 25 feet. So we've got a roll size that is 15 by 33 that you could use with that. So you would take something like that, and then you would cut out the entire middle section of that, Mike, to match up your putting green, right?
Yep. You'll probably have some waste there, but there are some ways that you could kind of repurpose that waste in other areas on that same job site.
Oh, for sure. And that's what we'll get to next. But so now you're talking about, you got me all confused here. You're talking about I can't cut from the top, but now I got to cut the top out and pull that middle section out and then drop in my putting green. How am I going to do all that?
Well, the best way to do that is to simply take your classic or premium and flip it on its face, right?
Okay.
So we got the back of that classic or premium. Do the same thing with your putting green on top of that classic or premium, right?
Okay, sure.
So now we've got the putting green on top of the classic or premium. We need a nice sharp knife, right?
Always brand new blade recommended.
Yep, always make sure you got a sharp knife. And now what we're going to do is try to cut through both of them at the same time without slicing ourselves on this little small demo.
A little difficult to do, but you seem to be getting through it well, Mike. And the challenge here is you really got to get through both pieces here. You're going to cut from the back. You're cutting the putting green on the top.
Right, cutting as close to vertical as you possibly can. And I don't know if I quite got through.
Yeah. You scored it, but you didn't quite get through, which that's one of the challenges. You know, here we're being a little more delicate on the table. You're going to be outside. You can roll that out on a driveway. You can roll it out on your base, but you'll get an opportunity to really puncture and get through both layers. But it's hard, as you can see here. You got to get through the putting green and you got to get through the turf itself in one shot, so you get a nice clean cut and you drop that middle section out to really penetrate and get in.
Yep. So we're going through it again here. Cut a little deeper this time.
Just don't mess up that Gator Studio table, Mike.
Might take a little bit of abuse here.
Yeah. All right, but we'll make sure we prove our point.
So hopefully we got a little bit closer there.
Yeah, you got a score line here, and we can get the general section here. So you're going to have this middle section cut out with your putting green. You're going to drop that into your classic or your premium blend. So, you know, what we recommend here is this is the best option, but there's going to be some design considerations. So we've got a 15 by 33 foot roll. That's great for your exterior, the rough around the putting green. Now, what you want to do then is design your putting green to meet that spec. If you start exceeding that as the perimeter of your putting green, now you're talking about having to seam the putting green to the rough or the premium classic, and then you're going to have to start streaming classic to classic and premium to premium, and you just really change the scope of the job. So the other thing to consider here is really design to the materials. Don't try to make your materials conform to some crazy design. It's going to be a lot more involved in that application.
Right. It's really tough to actually seam the putting green material together and get it completely seamless, you know, both from a visual perspective and a ball rolling perspective. So
absolutely.
Working with the available roll sizes, kind of utilizing that material as efficiently as possible would be a good decision.
Yeah, and let's take a look one more time at the dimensions on that graphic that we showed you, so you really get a good understanding of what we're talking about designing to that. That red perimeter would be, you know, what you would use on your classic or your premium turf. And then inside the putting green, you would want to make that conform to that. So 15 by 25 foot, that fits nicely. We've got a 15 by 33 foot roll. That would work out beautifully in that application, so you're not having to seam the exterior as well. And then if you come back in here, you get a rough example here of what that putting green would look like. You know, obviously we would clean that up in the final finished product, but that's what we're talking about, is cutting that interior out and then dropping it in. Now, you're going to cut out that interior, Mike. That could potentially be a lot of waste.
Well, it is waste if you don't reuse it somewhere, George. So what are we going to do with that extra piece of turf? You know, do they want a section where they're going to chip onto that green from?
Yeah.
You might use that for a little chipping pad somewhere else, or inlays and pavers, you know, a little area for the kids to play on. There's other ways to reutilize that turf, either on the same project or a different one.
Yeah, so chances are, if your homeowner, your client's asking for a putting green, they have a budget, and it's not going to be, you know, low end, because a putting green is going to be more expensive, and they're probably going to want more features into that whole outdoor living space. So like Mike said, maybe you want to consider a putting green and then repurpose some of that extra turf into a little chipping area. You could do a little play area for the kids to put a picnic table, a play set in that turf center that you cut out, and reuse that, so you're not just wasting that. But we're talking about best design and best applications. In our mind, in our view, the best applications are a single piece, make it uniform, cut it out, and then reuse that, repurpose that piece later, rather than trying to seam things together. Mike, that sounds like a nightmare.
Could get pretty difficult. And if you mess it up, you're wasting even more.
For sure. Very, very, very difficult. So that's the putting green. And we showed you a little tabletop here. We're going to show you our turf lineup video. We're going to meet you down in a larger scale application to show you how that putting green comes together, and we'll show you how to seam it together here next.
right, we got our turf here. We got a little contoured curve along the edge of our putting green.
This looks fantastic. So what we would have done in real life is this turf would have been laid down upside down, just like we showed you on the table. We would have cut the two pieces together. And Mike, we get a really natural looking turf edge here. This looks fantastic.
Right. You may have some differences depending on which way those grass blades are laying when you first put it down, but once you actually fluff it up and install that infill, get those blades pulled up, it'll start to look pretty uniform all around.
Perfect. Yeah.
But if you don't cut that single piece out, you got a lot of challenges with keeping the same blade orientation, seaming your corners or edges. So
yeah.
Really,
sure.
really tough to do.
And this gives you a great example here. You know, we've got our work cut out just seaming this together here, Mike. I can't even imagine having to seam, you know, more of this premium turf over there and stitch it out here as that rounds out. You know, it'd be much easier just to drop this in and just have that one seam to deal with than multiple seams.
Yep. So what we've got here, we got our premium turf and we have our putting green, right?
Right.
So two different pile heights, different weave, different feel and look to it.
Yeah, for sure.
So cutting from that back really gave us nice clean edges without damaging the turf itself, right? So if you cut from the top side and you're not perfectly vertical, you're not spreading those grass blades apart, you're going to be hacking things off unevenly, which is a problem. So we need that nice clean edge so that they match up nicely together, giving us a seamless finished look.
Yeah, that's going to be a nice roll on that ball too, you know, so you don't get that crooked bounce that as a golfer you really get annoyed with.
I don't know, I think they should all have to play with crooked bounces. All right. So we've got this here and we have to stick them together.
Yeah, well, how are we going to just stick them together, Mike? That's where our seam tape comes in.
And the XP glue that we talked about, right? We're going to use our seam tape and our XP glue.
Okay.
But I guess the challenge here, though, is that if we did something sort of like this, then we're talking about perhaps not having an even amount of seam tape under each side.
Then that, you know, I'm guessing, Mike's not going to be a good thing because you want a good bite equally across the entire seam. You don't want a little, you know, piece of that seam tape touching like I have here.
If we only have 2 inches and we're trying to keep our glue away from the center of the seam, you're not going to get any bonding on there, right? So we're going to have to use multiple pieces of seam tape.
Okay.
So if we cut our seam tape, now all of a sudden we can kind of come in
to follow the curve
at a slight angle, right? Staggering our pieces to follow that curve and try to keep our dashed line as close to the middle as possible, right? So now we get much better bite on both pieces of turf. We got closer to 5 or 6 inches of seam on each side.
Sure. And now you work with this here. Another little pro tip that we would recommend. Obviously, you know, you're going to be working along that seam there. You know, you're going to take a spike, drive it in, hold down the seam tape here. Mike, let's get a spike in there maybe.
All right.
And hold that seam tape down. That'll allow you to work a little more conveniently, and this isn't going to be shifting around on you. Once you line it up, like Mike pointed out, we want to make sure that you get uniform or more or less uniform pieces on that seam on both the right and left sides of the seam.
All right, so we've got our smaller pieces of seam tape kind of staggered around to help deal with that curve.
Right.
Now, once we get that done, it's very similar to a regular turf seam, whether it's straight or curved, right?
Yeah, exactly.
We come in with our XP adhesive.
Yep.
Now remember, that XP adhesive is nice and thick, and that's what helps give us a great bond on the turf. It coats the high points and the low points of that turf.
Yeah, it really goes into the peaks and valleys of that stitch gauge, which you can see here, the different gauge, and over there, you can really see under Mike's knees, you can really see the thickness of that stitch gauge on the premium turf blend. So the XP turf is going to work its way up there and really give you the maximum bond. What I like about this, Mike, and we talked about it before, is how clean that looks. You got a nice, uniform amount of adhesive, and you're not worried about traipsing it all over the turf, especially this putting green with that tight weave. Once you get glue on that, you're going to have a real problem.
Oh, it'll be a mess. You're not going to be able to clean it off. You're going to have to, trim it off and leave a visible imperfection.
And just like you said before on the straight seams, you're always keeping the glue on either side of the seam. You don't want to cross over that middle portion, especially on a putting green, because that has a potential to ooze out, and that'll really change the trajectory of the ball roll.
So when we do a straight seam with 2 pieces of say, classic or premium, we were almost working like a zipper, right? Working from one end, trying to keep those grass blades up and out of the seam, making sure they weren't tucked in underneath. But with the two different materials here, you don't really have that problem with the putting green.
Okay.
So we're still going to kind of work that zipper, but we're going to let George put his section of putting green down a little bit ahead of me, and I'm going to tuck my premium kind of up to
top.
it and over it.
All right, so we'll start.
So you can kind of go first, and then I tuck in to kind of cover what you've got going on with the edge of the grass there.
All right. Yeah, looking good. Now we're coming back in. You did a nice job keeping that glue away from the seam, Mike. So I think we're going to have a nice, clean-looking seam here. And really, if this were an actual putting green, you're going to have a nice play on this green.
Yeah, I think so.
You could come to my house anytime and install one.
So we're still going to push it down into the glue a little bit, right? Use our seam roller here. Make sure we're pushing that down into the adhesive, and we'll get our bags of infill on there to weight down the seam for a few hours. If you're working in extremely dry climates or dry areas, misting that seam tape and the adhesive down can help accelerate the curing process.
So same fundamentals apply with seaming. You know, you got the seam tape, you're going to use our XP adhesive, you're going to push it down, roll it in, get it into the peaks and valleys, weight it down. How long are we going to leave it weighted down?
Well, before you get into actually installing your spikes, you're probably going to want to wait 4 or 5 hours, give it some time to cure, right?
Okay, good. And speaking of spikes, Mike, just a recap on the spikes here. We're weighted our 4 or 5 hours. We're back at this. We've got a nice cured bond of our XP adhesive. What are we talking about spikes? I know our general practice is if we're on a perimeter of an artificial turf, it's every 6 inches on the perimeter.
Correct. So we still need a lot of spikes in the putting green material here. In fact, we need even more spikes because we're going to use a smaller one. Can you grab me one of those turf spikes there?
Absolutely.
So when we're talking about the artificial turf, the classic or the premium, you're going to be using a 6-inch non-galvanized spiral spike, right? Small enough head to fit in between the rows of stitching. But when we get into the putting green, we can't use that spike. It's too big. So we're going to use this 3.5-inch non-galvanized finish nail. So that's going to get down into that turf without leaving any kind of visible defect or a defect that the ball might hit and roll funny.
Right, yeah, that's going to be very key. You know, we have various different spikes. We recommend that 6-inch on the traditional classics and premium turf. But once you get into a putting green, that 6-inch and the head on that is just way too big.
Right, so we're going to use those smaller nails, and because they're smaller, we're going to use more of them to help hold things in place, right?
Right.
So we're going to go every 4 to 6 inches around the edge. We're going to do lines inside, maybe every 3 or 4 feet, where we're putting them 6 inches apart. So kind of double the number of spikes in the putting green compared to the regular turf.
Double the number. That's pretty crazy because regular turf is already out of control with the amount of spikes you're using.
Right, but a 3.5-inch finish nail is pretty small. So we want a lot of them in there. They'll rust into the ground. They'll help hold that turf down.
And that's what you want, so a nice clean ball roll.
And again, you got to be careful to try to drive them flush with the backing, but not overdrive them, right? We don't want to create any divots or dents in our putting green surface.
Certainly not. So that's the installation of the putting green. That seam is challenging, but we showed you a few ways to correct that. There's one more finishing touch, Mike, and that's the cup. I want to come back at the table and show some pro tips on how to install the whole cup on that and make sure that we do it right. And before we do that, let's just do a quick overview video of the entire installation process. Tim? All right, I got my #1 tech support guy here with my flag hole. So, Mike, you know, we always talk about the putting green, some of the challenges there. what we've realized is installing that whole cup is probably one of the more challenging components of the putting green itself.
Right, and if you don't do it, then the putting green's kind of useless, right?
Very useless, absolutely.
So we've got to install our cups. We've got to do it pretty cleanly and neatly, right? We don't want to have a big gap around them. And one of the challenges is that you really have to install that cup into your base before you put the turf down.
Yeah, let me get that straight. Before I get the turf down, that's an important factor that we're talking about here is you want to get that cup laid and placed before, and then you're going to cover it with the turf. That presents some challenges in my mind, Mike.
Right, well, let's think about it. It would be even worse to try to put your turf down, cut a hole, dig out for your cup. You're never going to dig a perfect hole. It's going to be collapsing. There's going to be void space. Not going to work. So that cup has to be installed first, and we roll our turf over top of that cup. Now, many guys are actually setting their cups in concrete. That makes sure that it's not going to move or shift over time. There's no void space or settling around that cup where that turf might drop down below the lip of the cup, causing a problem for that golf ball.
Yeah, for sure. That's a great best practice. Like Mike said, do it in a little concrete bed area. You get a nice, stable cup there, and that's the key. So we want to show you in a lot of these, and we'll have Tim pull up at some traditional putting greens so you can get a feel of it. Remember, we're doing artificial. We're installing in a backyard. They're more, for play. You look up here. A lot of these have, 3 or 4 cups in them. So Mike, we're saying you install all of these ahead of time. Get the cup in before you put the turf down.
Right, so we're going to leave that cup exposed maybe 3/8 of an inch or so above our compacted stone dust, right? So whatever our proposed height is, we'll come up a little bit above that. So when we roll our turf over top of it, we'll actually be able to tell kind of where that hole is.
Sure, okay. So this is a good little scenario here. We got a 2-cup putting green here. One we've already installed over here. If we look at the overhead, you can see we've got the 1 cup in there. Mike, that looks pretty clean. That's going to play pretty well. And then we want to find the other one. So you already, had that cup installed. You went under it. And now we're going to go back, find that, and cut into it. How do we do that?
Well, you're actually going to physically be able to feel it, right? That turf is going to be a little bit of a lump in that area where you have that cup. So you can kind of locate it by look and feel, right?
Okay.
And then once we locate our cup, we're going to cut down into the middle of it, right? So, hey, we're not exactly sure where the edges are, but we can probably get the middle of it.
Okay,
so we slice down into the middle of it towards the edge of our cup, right?
Sure.
In both directions till we hit the edge, right? Then we continue with kind of a cross pattern. So we cut it into pie quarters, right? So once we have our pie quarters, we can kind of work on finding the edge of that cup. So we're going to kind of roughly trim to start.
Okay.
Get our hole started here. And this takes a little bit of time. We're not going to spend the time to really dial it in, but effectively what you're doing is roughing out the hole and then coming back in and very carefully trying to trim vertically right around the inner lip of this hole. And as we trim around that inner lip, we're going to be able to stretch the turf around, continue trimming a little bit, and get a nice, seamless, uniform look.
Sure, absolutely. So what we're talking about here is, you're typically going to have a green that has 1 or multiple cups on it. Those cups get installed first. The turf goes down. Once the turf is down, you have the opportunity to then find that hole like Mike showed there and really go in and pull up the actual cup, make that cut, make it clean, but it's going to take a little craftsmanship. And, the other thing you saw Mike cutting from the top, that is one application where there really is no other way other than to cut from the top.
Unless you can hire a mole or something.
Yeah, that would be a pretty cool trick. So we want to start a transition now away from putting green. So before we do that, let's see if there's any questions that we want to cover before we get into those checkerboard applications. So Rick, how are we looking on the questions here?
I have a few questions over here, a couple about drainage, but the first one I want to ask is, can Gator Extreme Edge be used for the putting green cup for the hole?
Can Gator Extreme Edge be used for the putting green cup hole? I think, Mike, that might be an excellent use of Gator Extreme Edge.
That could be the longest lasting putting green hole in existence, right? 13,000 PSI concrete is certainly going to hold that in place, and I don't see any reason why you couldn't.
Yeah, it'd be a great application for it. Like you said, you got that fiber reinforcement, so you're not going to have cracking in that smaller application. You're hitting 3-4 times as strong as traditional bagged concrete. So Extreme Edge would be a great application for a whole cup.
All right, what else, Rick?
So stone dust doesn't drain very well. What about pea gravel as a setting bed?
All right. Stone dust doesn't drain well. I can agree with that, right? That's why we don't recommend it for pavers. It can tend to keep the pavers
Exactly
wet.
right.
Can tend to cause efflorescence, wet polymeric sand joints that aren't good.
Yep.
But for our purposes, with turf, turf's a plastic, right? Turf's not going to degrade. It's not going to have efflorescence. It's not going to suffer from a damp setting bed underneath. As far as pea gravel goes, the problem with pea gravel is that it's very unstable.
It's very unstable. It's like walking on a bunch of ball bearings. There's really no way to stop the movement of it.
Right, and because turf doesn't distribute the load, well, we're going to see the ball bearings, those pea gravel pieces, actually move underneath the turf as we walk on it, kids play on it, dogs run on it. So pretty soon, what you thought was a nice, even, uniform turf installation, it's going to be a lumpy, irregular looking lawn.
Yeah, and I love your analogy, Mike, that you use often. It's like a beach blanket that you put out there. You're going to have divots, and the more material moves, whether it's sand or whether it's pea gravel in this case, which would be more extreme movement. So definitely recommend that stone dust throughout all artificial turf applications, whether it's turf itself or the putting green as well.
What's next, Rick?
Yes, so this one goes back to the concrete overlay, or using concrete as a base. What size drainage holes do you recommend? And along with that, how many drainage holes?
All right. Well, my recommendation would be 2-inch core drilled drainage holes, not just your little 3/8 inch or 1/2 inch hammer drilled holes. We want large drainage holes. That's going to give us more surface area to the ground beneath to help it accept and absorb that water in there. And as far as how many, well, I'd like you to make that slab look like Swiss cheese. I'd like to see a hole every 2 or 3 feet.
Yeah.
Now, I can't tell you how many holes you need. I guess it depends partly on your pitch, where that water's flowing, how well your soils are going to drain underneath. But I'd say as a general rule of thumb, you probably want a hole at least every 5 feet and more anywhere water's going to gather.
Yeah, again, these overlay applications, it's a trade-off. You get great stability, but that drainage is a key factor. You've got to accommodate for the drainage. Not many people have a 2-inch core drill bit, Mike, but that's what we recommend, and every 2 to 3 feet on center. So you got a lot that goes into it if you're going to consider that overlay. Rick, how are we looking?
I have one more here.
All right.
What holds in the stone base when you're using the top-mounted plastic edging?
What holds in the stone base? I'm assuming, Mike, they're talking about the stone dust. If you're using that top-mounted plastic edging that you're nailing directly on top of the stone dust.
Right. So, what holds it in? Well, nothing. But what holds it in on a traditional paver project? Well, it's your backfilled soil, your grass that grows up against it, just the fact that it really has nowhere to go.
Yeah. And that's really, truthfully, one of the reasons, especially if you're using like one of those low-profile ones, there's not a lot of material there. That's why we really like that sunken pressure-treated or that sunken composite. You get a little more stability on that. The composite gives you some flexibility as well. That's really our number one option for edge restraint on an artificial turf project.
All right.
So let's move on, Mike. I want to talk about these checkerboard applications that we see.
Oh, those drive me nuts. Every contractor wants to install that checkerboard.
But they look so beautiful here. You see here, you can pull up any paver manufacturer's catalog and see, application like this. They're very common. They're very trendy right now. But there's some complications with that,
There's
Mike.
many complications. That's not the easiest application, the easiest way to potentially install there.
Yeah, this is a challenge, just like the putting greens. But we have some answers for you. We want to walk you through, again, what our best practice is for these checkerboard applications. So, the first option, Mike, would be if I said to you, hey, I want to do a large slab and I want some little 2-inch strips of turf in between those slabs. And I'm the homeowner, you're my contractor. What are you going to tell me?
Well, the first thing I'm going to tell you is that doing 2-inch strips in between is going to be a disaster.
Yeah.
Right? 2-inch strips of turf are floppy. They're not very strong. Seaming them together, you're not getting much seam tape underneath there.
Yeah.
Putting spikes in them, you're not getting a good, stagger on your spikes or ability. You get one line down the center. It's going to want to fold that turf in. You got all kinds of problems trying to do a thin strip in between your checkerboard pieces. So personally, I think you got to go at least 6 inches or wider.
That's really our recommendation is if you want to go with that strip on a checkerboard or some strip application, minimum of 6 inches or greater to give you better strength, better workability, the ability to seam things together, minimum of 6 inches. So when that homeowner tells you 2, tell them you're the expert. It's not going to look right, not going to hold, and get them into a 6-inch range or greater.
All right, so the next challenge you have is, well, actually cutting those strips, right?
Right.
So we need them to be pretty even and uniform.
Yep.
Cutting them from the back definitely helps.
Yeah.
We can go down that stitch line and get a pretty uniform piece. But unfortunately, we don't just need strips that are cut along the stitch line. We actually need pieces that are cut across the stitch line as well.
Yeah, and that's really the tricky part here is you can't just take strips and lay them in there and then lay the next. You're going to have to really match up a lot of things, the first of which is that blade orientation.
Right, we can't just turn pieces of our strips 90 degrees sideways. The blades aren't going to be going the right direction. The turf isn't going to look right. You're going to actually almost have a visual appearance of different colors here, George.
Yeah, and if we take a look at this, we've used 6 inches here, and we've used, just for an example, a 3 to 4 inch piece here, which we do not recommend. And Mike's laying them down how, many people would think you lay it down. You just start laying it in. If we take an overhead look at this application here, you're going to see, boy, this looks terrible. Did you use different colors on these? Some of them are going to look like, the blades are going different directions, so that's a nightmare.
Right, we've got to get all of the blades lined up in the same direction, so that means cutting strips long ways and crossways on our turf. Cutting strips crossways on the turf is a little bit tougher, right? You don't have that stitch line as a guide. You've really got to have a straight edge and a sharp blade and be meticulous in your cuts that are going across or perpendicular to those stitch lines.
Yeah. And then some of these are using kind of like a diagonal cut on it. That gets even more complicated. So you can do the strip option, and what we recommend there, again, minimum of 6 inches of strips, but you got to match the blade orientation. You have to match that in the parallel directions, and you have to match it in the perpendicular directions. And then, of course, you got to steam them all together, which presents another challenge.
Right. So it is tough, but hey, we can kind of do it. So we work our pieces here.
Sure.
Right? Pull that back. Let's get all of our pieces of turf lined up here. You can have that one.
All right.
So
let's.
This
has got to go this way. That goes that way. This one, I'm going the wrong way. Got to go towards you.
Yep. We got to turn around.
All
so
right.
you can see, you could do all of this. Maybe the guys you leave on the job site forget to turn a couple pieces around.
Yeah. And you know what? Look, let's look at that overhead view again. We got a little better. We got all our blades in the right orientation. We look a little better aesthetically. We look close. But now we got the problem. We got to seam all these together.
So now you got seams everywhere, right? We got seams all over this project, and they're small pieces, right? So as we lift up this one, well, we're disturbing the seam that we just made,
moving
right?
Around.
So it's still wet. Now we're moving that around. It's possible that we could throw the alignment off there.
Yep.
So it is a very challenging installation to do cleanly and neatly and have a good finished product by doing the strip method.
And these little things can add up to big things. Mike mentioned, hey, I'm going to move this little piece around, but now I just pulled it off of this one. Now, my buddy here that's helping me, he just stepped in the glue that I exposed, and now he's tracking glue on that. So these little things add up to big things. I don't know, I've never tried to get polyurethane glue off turf, but I suspect it's not easy.
Well, you're going to have to use xylene or acetone when it's wet. As soon as it dries, you're never getting it off.
Yeah.
You got to trim those blades off or replace that section of turf.
Right. So you could do these little cuts and strips, get them in the right orientation, all that. It's a challenge. It's not what we recommend. What we recommend, similar to what we talked about with the putting green, is you can do an application that takes a piece and cuts it out of the middle. So those pieces that we talked about here, as we line this up as we would, drop it in from the top. If you use a uniform piece, you're going to get a much cleaner installation on this. Mike, this looks a lot better. There's no seams to deal with, nothing really to look at here other than we got a spike on our perimeter and get this thing down.
So this looks good, right? Appearance-wise, this is fantastic. And it's also solid. Right? This entire piece is one solid piece of turf. All the backing is connected. We're not dealing with 10,000 seams all over the place trying to get all of our turf lined up, not get glue on our feet and spread it around. So there is a little bit of waste with this method, but your results are going to be much better.
Right, yeah. So the key point there is, you want to talk to your homeowner, understand these things as you get into your first job and they want the checkerboard. It seems easy to cut these little strips and kind of tack them in, but there's a lot of challenges with that that we exposed.
The other way to look at it, though, is, hey, there's going to be some waste if I cut out all these squares, right?
Of course.
there's also going to be 5 times as much labor if I try to do all these strips. So balancing out the waste of the turf that you're cutting out versus the amount of time it's going to take to cut all those strips, seam all those little pieces together, it may balance out in the end.
Absolutely. And the time, excuse me, on a callback when some of those strips start peeling up.
Yep, that's true as well, right?
Yeah.
The other thing that you might notice is that these pavers are sticking out like icebergs here, George.
Yeah, these are a big trip hazard. That's the last thing to consider here is how do we handle that height differential?
Well, we're going to have to put our block down, right?
Yep.
And then actually add some stone dust in between to raise the height of our setting bed up and get that turf to the proper level. So we probably want to have that turf anywhere from 3/8 to 3/4 of an inch below the paver or stone surface.
Yeah, so after you put this down, you're going to install the slabs, the stepping stones, and then you're going to have to bring that base material up, and you're going to have to bring it up, like Mike says, 3/8 to 3/4.
Right. So, hey, it's a popular application, a popular look. I personally would never go ahead and do the strip method.
Yeah, I wouldn't either. Too many complications in that. And so if we look at the summary here again, if you want to do a checkerboard, what are the best practices? Number one, we feel you should cut the entire piece out and avoid that strip method. If you do the strip method, or even if you're cutting it out, you want to have a minimum of 6 inches of strip in between the stones or the slabs. You need to match the blade orientation, and that's in the parallel direction and also the perpendicular direction. And then you want to raise the turf height, and you got to bring that set at 3/8 to 3/4 of an inch below the paver surface. If you look at the screen here, Mike, they've really done a couple things that we don't recommend on this particular application here.
So first of all, those strips are way too narrow.
Way too narrow.
Right? Super narrow strips. They're going to be unstable, harder to secure. They're also too high, right? It looks like they're about flush with the paver surface, and the backing's showing through. And then those blades are going all over the place.
Yeah, they're going in every which direction.
It's not just 2 different directions. I think it's like every piece is a different direction to the one next to it.
Yeah, that's a challenge. But you could see there, and then you can also see they're starting to potentially peel up off of that. So you're looking at callbacks. So the basic fundamentals that we outline here, cutting with the whole piece, is going to give you the best possible installation to avoid any callbacks, Mike.
All right.
So we've covered some of the challenging applications, but some of the more popular applications. Before we get into some quoting considerations, Rick, do we have any questions we want to address?
I think we're good right now. We answered Rob's question a second ago with the blanket method, as he called it. So I think we're okay on questions if you guys want to keep going.
But hey, I learned something. I like the blanket method. I think that's the best way to do these things. So good. So keep the questions coming. As we wrap up here, we want to address some of the quote considerations. Mike, we've gotten into this. We've been studying this field, this category for about 18 months now. And we're talking to a lot of people, and they're asking us, how do we bid this stuff?
Right. We've talked to many contractors who install turf, but we've talked to quite a few contractors who don't install turf, right? They've said, a customer asked me about it, but I wasn't quite sure how to do it or what to charge, so I told them I don't do it. Yeah,
and that's not what we want to hear. Hey, take the opportunity. We offer great training. You can contact your local rep. They can do all the demos and stuff that we did here, but do them hands-on in front of you and get you exposed to it so you're ready to quote that job. But when you quote that job, there's going to be some considerations to think through, Mike.
Right. A lot of people think that installing turf is going to be cheap, right?
Yeah.
So I roll this stuff out and I'm done.
Yeah,
so,
why not?
I don't know, what, $8-10 a square foot?
Yeah.
That works, right?
Right.
Doesn't.
Probably not. So we showed you at the beginning the cross section of an artificial turf application. It's almost going to mirror exactly a traditional paver application. And there's where a lot of the similarities are. It's in that base prep. So, you got compacted soil, you got a geotextile, you got compacted base, and then you got the layer stone dust, which differs, and then you got the wearing course.
Right, so there's a lot of cost and effort that goes into the proper base prep, right?
Right.
So we're doing the same foundation as we're doing for pavers. So really, the costs are identical at that point.
Yeah, your base prep, that part, what we refer to, really like a fixed cost, and we're approaching this from you're installing pavers. Well, that fixed portion of the paver cost, which is the material cost, and the base prep, which includes your excavation, your dense graded material, maybe not the stone dust, but you'd have a sand setting bed there. Those costs, Mike, they're more or less fixed, and they're gonna encompass probably about 80% of a job cost.
I agree. I mean, the cost of the pavers versus the turf is very similar, right? Pavers, hey, we got to buy pavers, we got to do polymeric sand, edge restraint, but with turf, we've got to buy the turf itself, the infill, the spikes. Very similar overall cost and overall effort there.
Right. So the scary part becomes that last 20%. That's your variable costs, your roll sizes, which have to deal with how much you got to cut it, which has to deal with how much you're going to seam. There's a lot of labor in the seaming aspect of artificial turf, as we just showed you. That's going to be part of the variable cost. How many nails you're using? You got to spread infill and then brush the infill in and keep it fluffy and look natural. So
but in many ways, it's still similar to pavers, right? Doing a rectangular patio with no border is a lot easier than doing a curved contoured patio with a border and an inlay. So again, the design, the actual layout of your project will determine how long it takes and what it ends up costing.
Right. So your costs are going to be very similar. We're not doing a complete bidding and estimating, overhead recovery kind of class here. We're just trying to get you to think when you approach that first job, just remember if you're charging, say, $20 a square foot for paving stones, you're probably not going to be too far off that $20 for turf, Mike.
Right. Maybe you can do it a little bit faster.
Yep.
Maybe you can't. So, hey, is it 18 bucks a square foot? That's entirely possible, but it's not going to be 10 or 12.
No, it's not going to be 10 or 12. That's why we say 20% of that is probably that variable cost. So if you're installing pavers at 20 bucks, knock off 20%, you're in the 16 range. Somewhere between 16 and 20 might be what you need to charge for that. We don't know your business. We can't tell you that, but
bidding by the square foot's a bad idea.
It's
anyway.
always terrible. Always terrible idea.
But we're just trying to do some comparison here.
Yeah, it gets you into that. Just a basic understanding that hey, 80% is going to be the same. 20% you got to play with. So don't underbid this because you think, hey, I'm just kicking out a roll of turf and
over
I'm
the
done.
dirt, and that's it, right?
Yeah. So good. All right. So as we wrap up here, Rick, how are we looking at questions? Anything we want to address here before we close out the program today?
I do have one more question for us to end on here, and it's a question about another potential base material. How do we feel about Gator base as a use here?
Well, love this question. We get it all the time, Mike.
Yep. Well, why don't you field that one, George?
I will absolutely field it. So Gator base, it's a synthetic base replacement. These are excellent applications for artificial turf. We don't actively promote it due to some licensing agreements, but as far as turf applications, Gator base has its roots in artificial turf applications. We only promote it for traditional hardscaping applications, but there are synthetic bases, Mike, that work great for artificial turf.
Yep, that's for sure. Good option. Do a little research on your own online, and you may find some videos with similar products being used in that application.
Absolutely. So that's some of the more traditional questions we're fielding on some more involved applications. We've got some incredible resources on our Gator Studio webpage. Anything from blogs to video programming on how to seam, installing infill. Great blog post, Mike, on why we use infill to get into that earlier question. So we encourage you to take advantage of that, sign up for our blog, and reach out to your local rep. We do these kinds of trainings, on an ongoing basis with our team, so they're well versed to come out and show you how to do this stuff in a good hands-on demo, Mike.
Right. Ask us questions. Hey, we're here to help you. We're here to learn. We're here to come up with solutions. We didn't really like any of those manufactured plastic edge options. We thought that they had some issues.
Right.
The wisdom of the old-time installers with turf, with that ledger board, with the pressure treated, with the composite, hey, that really does seem to work the best and be the most efficient. So we're always here to help bring you some solutions to your problems and give you some guidance on getting into the artificial turf.
Great. All right. So we'll close up the program here. Thank you very much for coming and participating. Reach out if you have questions, and wish you the best of success in the upcoming 25 season. Thanks.